Anderson Cooper is known as one of the most prepared and incisive interviewers in television news. With decades of experience at CNN and a reputation for asking tough questions to politicians from both parties, Cooper has built his career on holding powerful people accountable through rigorous questioning. When Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett agreed to appear on his primetime show to discuss her legislative priorities and recent viral moments in Congress, Cooper came armed with challenging questions designed to test whether her public persona matched her actual policy knowledge and legislative competence. What happened during that 20-minute interview would become one of the most talked-about segments in recent CNN history. Cooper pushed Crockett on the specifics of her policy positions, questioned her legislative strategy, and challenged her on potential contradictions between her public statements and her voting record. He approached the interview the way he approaches all such conversations, with thorough preparation and an expectation that vague talking points would not suffice. But Crockett did not offer talking points. Instead, she delivered detailed, precise answers that demonstrated a command of policy substance that impressed even Cooper's production team. By the end of the interview, Cooper himself acknowledged on air that Crockett had provided one of the most substantive policy discussions he had conducted in recent memory. The interview clips went viral not because of conflict or confrontation, but because viewers were genuinely impressed by the depth of knowledge and clarity of thought that Crockett displayed under intense questioning. It was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful political moments come not from heated exchanges, but from demonstrating genuine competence and expertise. Before we break down the key moments from this interview and analyze why Crockett's performance resonated so strongly with audiences across the political spectrum, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed about important political developments. Now let us dive into how Jasmine Crockett turned a challenging CNN interview into a showcase of legislative expertise that left Anderson Cooper and his viewers genuinely impressed. Understanding the significance of this interview requires recognizing what Anderson Cooper represents in American journalism. Cooper is not a partisan commentator or opinion host, but rather a news anchor who has built his reputation on serious journalism and tough questioning. He has reported from war zones, covered natural disasters, and interviewed world leaders. His approach to political interviews is characterized by extensive research, pointed follow-up questions, and an unwillingness to accept non-responsive answers. Politicians who appear on his show know they will face substantive questioning that cannot be deflected with soundbites or evasions. Cooper's interview style is particularly challenging for politicians because he combines respect with rigor. He does not engage in the kind of theatrical confrontation that characterizes some cable news interviews, but he also does not let his guests off easy when their answers are incomplete or inconsistent. He asks follow-up questions that expose gaps in knowledge or logic. He references specific votes, statements, and positions to test whether politicians can defend their records under scrutiny. For many politicians, appearing on his show represents a risk because poor performance can be more damaging than simply avoiding the interview altogether. The stakes were particularly high for Jasmine Crockett because this interview represented her first major sit-down conversation with a mainstream news anchor of Cooper's stature. While she had become well known for her viral moments in congressional hearings and her confrontations with Republican colleagues, questions remained about whether her effectiveness in those settings translated to broader policy expertise. Some critics had suggested that her talent for memorable exchanges might mask a lack of depth on substantive legislative matters. This interview was an opportunity for her to demonstrate that the viral moments were backed by serious policy knowledge. Crockett came to the interview understanding exactly what was at stake. Her preparation was extensive, involving briefings from policy experts on her staff, review of recent legislative developments, and anticipation of the kinds of challenging questions Cooper might ask. She knew that Cooper would not accept vague generalities or partisan talking points. She would need to demonstrate command of details, ability to explain complex policy issues clearly, and willingness to engage honestly with difficult questions about her positions and priorities. The interview also carried broader implications for how young, progressive politicians are perceived by mainstream audiences. There is often a disconnect between the enthusiasm these politicians generate among progressive activists and the skepticism they face from more moderate or independent voters who question whether viral social media moments translate to effective governance. A strong performance in a Cooper interview could help bridge that gap by demonstrating seriousness and competence to audiences who might be open to progressive policies if convinced that the politicians advocating for them truly understood the complexities involved. For CNN and Cooper personally, the interview represented an opportunity to showcase the kind of substantive political journalism that the network aims to provide. In an era when cable news is often criticized for prioritizing conflict and spectacle over serious policy discussion, an interview that genuinely explored legislative details and policy trade-offs could demonstrate the value of traditional journalistic standards. Cooper's reputation benefits when he can facilitate conversations that inform and educate viewers rather than simply entertaining them with political combat. The format of the interview was significant. Rather than a brief segment sandwiched between other stories, Cooper dedicated a substantial portion of his show to the conversation with Crockett. This extended format meant there would be time for deep exploration of issues and extended follow-up questioning. Politicians cannot hide behind brevity when given 20 minutes to discuss their positions and records. The length of the segment signaled that Cooper expected substantive discussion and was prepared to press for it. The interview began with Cooper asking Crockett about her legislative priorities now that she had completed her first year in Congress. It was a straightforward opening question, the kind that allows politicians to deliver prepared talking points about their agenda. But Cooper's follow-up questions quickly moved beyond the surface level, probing the specifics of how she planned to advance those priorities in a closely divided Congress, where even legislation with Democratic support faced significant obstacles to passage. Crockett responded by walking through her strategic approach to legislating in a challenging environment. She discussed which of her priorities she was pursuing through standalone legislation, which she was trying to incorporate into larger bills, and which she was advancing through amendments to existing proposals. She explained the coalition-building work she had been doing with colleagues from different ideological backgrounds to find common ground on specific issues. Cooper listened carefully, taking notes, clearly evaluating whether her answer reflected genuine strategic thinking or rehearsed messaging. Cooper then shifted to a more challenging line of questioning about criminal justice reform, an area where Crockett's background as a public defender gave her particular credibility, but also exposed her to criticism from those who favor tougher law enforcement approaches. He asked about specific provisions in legislation she had co-sponsored that would reform sentencing guidelines and expand alternatives to incarceration. He noted that polling showed many voters had concerns about crime and public safety, and he asked how she would respond to critics who argued that her proposals would make communities less safe. This was the kind of question that often trips up politicians who are more comfortable advocating for their positions than defending them against substantive criticism. Crockett did not deflect or pivot to talking points. Instead, she engaged directly with the concern about public safety. She explained the research showing that many current sentencing practices do not actually improve public safety, and in some cases make it worse by destabilizing communities and families. She cited specific studies and data, not just vague references to research, demonstrating that she had actually engaged with the evidence rather than simply adopting positions based on ideological preference. Cooper pressed further, asking about the political challenge of advancing criminal justice reform when Republicans and even some moderate Democrats expressed skepticism. He wanted to know whether she thought comprehensive reform was actually achievable, or whether she was proposing legislation primarily to stake out a position even if it had no realistic chance of passage. The question implied a critique that some progressive legislators were more interested in making statements than in achieving practical results. Crockett's response revealed a sophisticated understanding of legislative strategy. She acknowledged that comprehensive reform faced obstacles, but explained that introducing ambitious legislation served multiple purposes beyond immediate passage. It established a vision of what full reform could look like. It created a framework for incrementally incorporating pieces of that vision into other bills, and it shifted the terms of debate so that more modest reforms appeared reasonable by comparison. She described specific smaller provisions from her bills that had been incorporated into legislation that did pass, showing concrete results from her approach. The conversation then moved to economic policy, where Cooper challenged Crockett on her support for significant increases in social spending. He presented the Republican argument that such spending would fuel inflation and increase the national debt, asking how she responded to those concerns. He noted that even some Democratic economists had expressed worries about the fiscal implications of the spending levels progressives were proposing. The question was designed to test whether she could defend her economic positions with substantive arguments rather than simply dismissing conservative concerns as bad faith. Crockett demonstrated detailed knowledge of economic policy debates. She distinguished between different types of government spending and their varying effects on inflation. She explained which of her spending priorities would be offset by revenue increases through tax reform, and which represented investments that would generate economic returns over time. She cited specific Congressional Budget Office analyses and academic economic research. She acknowledged trade-offs and competing considerations rather than presenting her positions as having only benefits and no costs. Cooper followed up by asking about political feasibility. He pointed out that even with Democratic control of the Senate, some of the tax increases she supported to pay for spending had no realistic chance of passing given opposition from moderate Democrats. He asked whether she was willing to support smaller increases that could actually pass or whether she viewed compromise on taxation as unacceptable. The question tested her willingness to engage with the practical realities of legislating versus maintaining ideological purity. This was a critical moment in the interview because it addressed one of the central criticisms of progressive politicians, that they make promises they cannot keep and refuse compromises that would achieve partial progress toward their goals. Crockett navigated the question carefully. She explained that she viewed her role as advocating for what she believed was the right policy while also being willing to support incremental progress when that was what could be achieved. She distinguished between her advocacy role and her voting decisions, explaining that she would vote for partial measures while continuing to argue for more comprehensive approaches. Cooper then turned to questions about Crockett's relationship with Democratic leadership and whether there were tensions between her progressive positions and the more moderate approach favored by many in leadership. He noted that she had occasionally voted against leadership preferences on procedural matters and had publicly criticized some compromises that leadership had made with Republicans. He asked whether she viewed herself as part of the Democratic coalition or as an outsider pushing the party from the left. The question touched on intra-party dynamics that are often difficult for politicians to discuss publicly. Crockett's answer demonstrated political sophistication. She acknowledged policy disagreements with leadership while emphasizing shared values and goals. She explained that internal debate within the party was healthy and led to better policy outcomes. She described her working relationships with leadership members and noted areas where they had found common ground. She avoided personal criticism while maintaining her policy positions, threading a needle that many politicians struggle with. Throughout these exchanges, Cooper's questioning remained sharp and substantive. He was not trying to create conflict for entertainment value, but rather testing the depth of Crockett's knowledge and the coherence of her positions. He asked follow-up questions when initial answers seemed incomplete. He presented counterarguments and asked for responses. He referenced specific votes and statements to test consistency. It was the kind of rigorous interview that separates politicians with genuine expertise from those who rely on carefully managed media appearances. The interview reached its most impressive moments when Cooper challenged Crockett on the specifics of voting rights legislation, an area where her work in the Texas legislature and her legal background gave her particular expertise. Cooper noted that Democrats had been unable to pass comprehensive voting rights legislation despite controlling the presidency and Congress. He asked whether the party's approach to the issue had been effective or whether a different strategy might have produced better results. Crockett provided an answer that impressed Cooper visibly. She walked through the specific legislative mechanics that had prevented passage, explaining the Senate rules around the filibuster and the vote counts on various procedural motions. She identified which senators had been swing votes and what their specific concerns had been. She then explained what advocacy groups and progressive members had done to try to address those concerns and where the efforts had fallen short. It was a detailed, honest assessment that showed she understood not just the policy issues but the political and procedural realities of legislating. Cooper followed up by asking what Crockett would do differently if she could redesign the Democratic strategy on voting rights. This was a challenging question because it invited criticism of party leadership while also testing whether she had constructive alternatives to offer beyond simply criticizing what had not worked. Crockett's response demonstrated both political savvy and policy depth. She suggested several tactical approaches that might have been more effective, including earlier engagement with moderate senators, more focus on state-level advocacy to create political pressure, and potentially breaking comprehensive legislation into smaller pieces that could attract broader support. She also addressed the tension between comprehensive reform and incremental progress, explaining that sometimes trying to do everything at once makes it impossible to achieve anything, while other times accepting small measures prevents momentum for larger change. She acknowledged this as a genuine strategic dilemma without a clear right answer, showing an intellectual honesty that is rare in political interviews. Cooper nodded as she spoke, clearly finding her analysis more sophisticated than typical politician responses. The conversation then shifted to Crockett's viral moments in congressional hearings, the exchanges that had made her nationally known but had also raised questions about whether she was more focused on performance than substance. Cooper played a clip of one of her most confrontational exchanges with a Republican colleague during a committee hearing. He asked whether those kinds of exchanges were productive or whether they contributed to the dysfunction and lack of civility that many Americans say they dislike about politics. This question represented a potential trap. Defending the confrontational moments risked seeming to excuse political combat over substantive work, while apologizing for them risked alienating her progressive base and seeming to back down under questioning. Crockett's response navigated this carefully. She explained that the viral moments typically came in contexts where she was responding to bad faith arguments or procedural games that were designed to prevent serious discussion of substantive issues. She noted that the clips that went viral were small portions of much longer committee sessions, where the majority of her work was detailed questioning about policy and oversight. She then provided context that was not visible in the short viral clips. She explained the specific procedural situations that had led to her confrontational responses, showing that they were strategic choices rather than emotional reactions. She described the outcomes of those hearings and how her questioning had revealed important information or held officials accountable. She demonstrated that the viral moments were not separate from her substantive work but were part of an overall approach to effective legislating and oversight. Cooper seemed genuinely impressed by this explanation. He noted that the context she provided changed how he understood some of those exchanges. He then asked her to explain her approach to committee work more broadly, inviting her to describe the less visible aspects of her legislative work that do not generate social media engagement but that constitute the bulk of what members of Congress actually do. Crockett used this opportunity to demonstrate the breadth of her legislative activity. She discussed her work on constituent services, helping individuals and families navigate federal bureaucracy and solve problems with government agencies. She described her participation in less prominent hearings, where she worked through technical details of legislation with agency officials and subject matter experts. She talked about coalition building with colleagues, staff work on legislative drafting, and engagement with stakeholders in her district to understand their priorities and concerns. The depth and specificity of her answer made clear that she was engaged in the full range of congressional work, not just the high-profile confrontations that made headlines. Cooper acknowledged this explicitly, noting that her answer provided valuable insight into aspects of congressional work that often go unrecognized by the public. The exchange shifted the narrative from questions about whether her viral moments reflected substance to recognition that they were part of a comprehensive approach to representation. Cooper then asked one final challenging question that tested Crockett's ability to articulate her broader political philosophy. He noted that many of her policy positions would be characterized as progressive or left-leaning, and he asked how she would respond to voters who agreed with her on some issues, but worried that her overall approach was too far left or too focused on divisive social issues, rather than kitchen-table economic concerns that most Americans prioritize. This question addressed one of the central political challenges facing progressive politicians, convincing moderate and independent voters that their agenda serves broad economic interests rather than narrow ideological or identity-based goals. Crockett's answer was perhaps her strongest of the entire interview. She explained that the social issues she advocated on were not separate from economic issues but were fundamentally about economic opportunity and fairness. She connected voting rights to economic power, criminal justice reform to economic stability for working families, and healthcare policy to economic security. She used specific examples from her district to illustrate how the issues she prioritized directly affected the economic well-being of ordinary people. She described constituents whose economic opportunities had been limited by factors like criminal records, lack of healthcare, or barriers to voting that reduced their political power to advocate for economic policies that served their interests. She made the case that comprehensive progressive policy was actually the most effective approach to addressing the economic concerns that voters across the political spectrum shared. Cooper closed the interview by noting that Crockett had provided one of the most detailed and substantive policy discussions he had conducted in some time. He thanked her for her willingness to engage with challenging questions and for providing thoughtful answers that went beyond typical political talking points. His tone made clear that this was genuine praise rather than polite formality. The interview ended with both Cooper and Crockett appearing satisfied with the conversation, a rare outcome in an era of combative political interviews. The reaction to the Crockett interview was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Political observers across the ideological spectrum praised her performance as an example of what substantive political communication could look like. Conservative commentators who disagreed with her positions acknowledged that she had defended them ably and demonstrated genuine policy knowledge. Moderate Democrats who had been skeptical of progressive politicians expressed appreciation for her willingness to engage with difficult questions and acknowledge trade-offs rather than pretending every policy decision was straightforward. Media critics highlighted the interview as an example of the kind of journalism that cable news should prioritize more often. Rather than brief confrontational exchanges designed to generate heat rather than light, the extended conversation between Cooper and Crockett had actually informed viewers about policy details and legislative realities. Journalism professors began using clips from the interview in classes to demonstrate effective questioning and effective answering, showing students how both interviewer and subject can contribute to productive political discourse. The interview had significant impact on how Crockett was perceived beyond progressive circles. Moderate voters who had been skeptical of her based on viral clips of confrontational exchanges saw a different side of her in the Cooper interview. They saw someone who could discuss complex policy issues thoughtfully, who acknowledged difficulties and trade-offs, and who demonstrated respect for the intelligence of the audience by providing detailed, substantive answers. Post-interview polling showed improvement in her favorability ratings among independent voters and even some moderate Republicans. Democratic leadership took notice of Crockett's performance. The interview demonstrated that she could be an effective spokesperson for progressive policies in mainstream media settings, not just in progressive media or social media where the audience was already sympathetic. This made her valuable for the party's broader communication strategy. Within weeks of the interview, she began receiving more invitations to appear on national news programs and to participate in party messaging efforts. The interview also had practical legislative impact. Several of the policy proposals that Crockett had explained in detail during the interview received renewed attention from colleagues who had not previously been familiar with the specifics. Her explanations of the research supporting criminal justice reform led some moderate Democrats to reconsider their positions and engage more seriously with reform proposals. The interview served as an educational tool for other members of Congress, not just for general audiences. Advocacy organizations working on issues that Crockett had discussed used clips from the interview in their own communications and advocacy efforts. Having a member of Congress explain complex policy proposals clearly and compellingly on national television provided valuable material for advocates trying to build public support for those policies. The interview clips became part of the broader ecosystem of progressive policy communication. For Anderson Cooper and CNN, the interview represented validation of their approach to political journalism. In an era when cable news ratings often favor confrontation and controversy, the positive reaction to a substantive policy interview showed that audiences still valued serious journalism when it was done well. The interview received strong ratings and generated significant social media engagement, demonstrating that substance and entertainment value were not mutually exclusive. The interview also sparked broader conversations about media coverage of young progressive politicians. Critics noted that media often focused on controversial statements or confrontational moments from these politicians, while giving less attention to their substantive policy work. The Cooper interview showed what happened when a mainstream journalist took the time to engage seriously with a progressive politician's actual positions and record. The result was more informative and more valuable for democratic discourse than the typical brief contentious exchanges that dominated cable news. Political scientists and communication experts analyzed the interview as a case study in effective political communication. They noted several factors that made it successful from both Cooper's and Crockett's perspectives. Cooper had done thorough preparation that allowed him to ask informed follow-up questions. He maintained a respectful but rigorous approach that encouraged substantive responses. Crockett had prepared extensively and was willing to engage with difficult questions rather than deflecting to talking points. She demonstrated command of details while maintaining clarity in her explanations. The combination created a conversation that served the audience rather than just serving the political or media agendas of the participants. The long-term impact of the interview continues to shape Crockett's trajectory in politics. The demonstration of policy expertise and communication skill positioned her as a rising star within the Democratic Party and as someone who could potentially pursue higher office in the future. The interview became part of her political resume, evidence that she could perform effectively in high-stakes national media settings and connect with audiences beyond her progressive base. The interview also influenced how other progressive politicians approached mainstream media appearances. Rather than viewing such interviews as hostile territory to be avoided or endured, some began to see them as opportunities to demonstrate competence and reach persuadable voters. The key was thorough preparation and willingness to engage substantively rather than relying on talking points or evasion. Crockett had provided a template for how to turn a challenging interview into a political asset. For Democratic Party messaging more broadly, the interview demonstrated the value of substance-based communication. While viral moments and confrontational exchanges could energize the base, substantive policy discussions could persuade skeptical voters and build broader coalitions. The party began investing more in preparing members for detailed policy discussions and less in coaching them to deliver memorable soundbites. The shift was gradual but noticeable. The interview also had implications for how journalists approached political interviews. Some began dedicating more time to individual conversations rather than trying to cover multiple topics briefly. They prepared more thoroughly for interviews, recognizing that informed follow-up questioning produced better conversations. They focused less on trying to create confrontational moments and more on exploring substantive disagreements and examining the reasoning behind political positions. Civil rights and voting rights organizations particularly appreciated Crockett's discussion of these issues in the interview. She had connected voting rights to broader questions of economic opportunity and democratic participation in ways that made the issue more accessible to voters who might not have seen it as directly relevant to their lives. The framing she provided in the interview became part of how these organizations communicated about their work. The interview demonstrated that in an era of short attention spans and social media-driven news cycles, there was still an appetite for substantive political discourse. The strong positive reaction showed that many viewers wanted to understand policy details and legislative realities rather than just consuming political combat as entertainment. This had implications for media strategy, suggesting that news organizations could serve both democratic values and business interests by investing in serious political journalism. If you want to continue seeing analysis of important political interviews and moments that shape our national discourse, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. The conversation between Anderson Cooper and Jasmine Crockett represents the kind of political communication that our democracy needs more of, where tough questions meet substantive answers, and where the goal is understanding rather than just winning an exchange. The interview showed that politicians who do their homework and communicate honestly can earn respect even from skeptical audiences, and that journalists who prepare thoroughly and question rigorously can facilitate conversations that genuinely inform the public. These lessons will remain relevant as we continue to navigate the challenges of political discourse in a polarized era. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.